Hi, my name is Ryan, and in this video I want to respond to Alex O'Connor's video on the ontological argument. Alex is actually a very good friend of mine, and he's one of the sharpest minds I've ever met. But that doesn't mean he can't be wrong about this argument. So, let's listen to his first objection.
The first problem that we run into is that these properties are contradictory and paradoxical. Okay, firstly, we have omnipotence. Nothing can truly be all-powerful. This is a common philosophical thought, and you've probably heard it best exemplified in the famous dilemma. Could God create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it?
Alex's first objection is a little bit of an odd one, because it's not really an objection to the ontological argument at all. What it is an objection to what a maximally great being would be like if it did exist. It wouldn't be omnipotent, says Alex, because omnipotence is logically incoherent. And it certainly wouldn't be omnipotent and omniscient, because these two properties are jointly inconsistent. So while a maximally great being might very well be, very powerful and very knowledgeable, perhaps even omniscient, there's no chance he's omnipotent. That's all fine and well, but how exactly is this supposed to be a challenge to the argument? It seems to me it's only a challenge to the argument if we treat maximally great being as a definite description, which can only refer to an omnipotent being. A definite description is one that only refers to a single specific thing, like the way CosmicSkeptic refers to Alex O'Connor and Alex O'Connor alone. But why should we treat it like that? Especially when it really seems like we should treat it like an indefinite description. An indefinite description is one that can refer to many things, like the way world's most well-spoken atheist once referred to this guy, but now refers to this guy. This is exactly what Nagasawa argues in his book, Maximal God. He argues that maximally great being is an indefinite description that refers to the greatest possible being. And the greatest possible being would be one that has every great making property to its highest degree possible. So if omnipotence happened to be impossible, then this being would just have the highest degree of power that was possible. So for example, if the power to do 99% of all actions was the highest degree of power possible, then this being would just have that power instead. And so maximally great being wouldn't refer to an omnipotent being, but would refer to a being that has the power to do 99% of all things. The point is, even if omnipotence is impossible, it doesn't follow that a maximally great being is impossible, because a maximally great being isn't necessarily omnipotent. And so, if this were Alex's only objection to the argument, a proponent could simply reply, "Oh, so that's what it's like for a maximally great being to exist. Thanks, Alex," and then proceed merrily on her way. Now, to be fair to Alex, although the argument itself doesn't specify that the maximally great being has to be omnipotent, the video kind of does when it says this.
And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
But then, to be fair to the video, it's trying to explain what can be a very complicated argument in less than 5 minutes. And so it makes sense that it would need to assume that some of these properties are possible in order to avoid any unnecessary complications. Still, many theists, including myself, think that the property of omnipotence is possible. And so the paradox of the stone is not something that can be simply swept under the rug. Rather, what we need to do is take a quick look at the academic literature to see if there are any potential solutions to this problem. In God and Other Minds, Plantinga argues that it's logically impossible for a being that can lift anything to create a stone so heavy it can't lift it, because that would just be a contradiction. And it's no skin off God's nose if he can't do contradictions. He can't make square circles or married bachelors either. So the paradox of the stone is really no objection to his omnipotence, because it's just a logical impossibility. Now, it might sound a bit ad hoc to say that, oh yes, God can do anything except for this set of logically impossible things over here. Yeah, anything except those things. That is until you realize that logically impossible things aren't really things at all. There are no square circles. There are no married bachelors. These things, they don't even exist as concepts in our minds. They're just gobbledygook that sound like they refer to something real, but in reality they don't. So asking whether God can do a logical impossibility is a lot like asking whether God can make a blah blah blah. But there's no such thing as a blah blah blah. It has no referent. So it doesn't even make sense to ask the question. Another potential solution comes from Wade Savage, who argues that the wording of the paradox is misleading. It sounds like there's something God can't do, but actually, the proposition God can't create a stone so heavy he can't lift it is logically equivalent to if God can create a stone, then he can lift it. And although the former proposition seems like a lack of power, the latter clearly isn't. And so yeah, God can't create a stone so heavy he can't lift it. But that's because he's all-powerful, not because he lacks power. Richard Swinburne, however, argues that both of these solutions fail. He thinks that God could create a stone so heavy he couldn't lift it, but if he ever did, he would cease to be omnipotent. So think of it like this. Imagine a timeline, right? And at first, God is omnipotent on this timeline because he could create the stone so heavy that he couldn't lift it. But immediately after he's made said stone, he ceases to be omnipotent because now there's something he can't do, namely lift the stone. So for Swinburne, God's so powerful, he has the power to lose his power should he choose to exercise that power. Yeah. My own solution to the paradox is pretty much the same as Swinburne's, except I would add that a maximally great being wouldn't just have omnipotence, but rather necessary omnipotence. And necessary omnipotence is omnipotence at all times, in all places, in all possible worlds. And so my argument goes like this. A necessarily omnipotent being wouldn't be able to create a stone so heavy it couldn't lift it, because if it ever did, then it would lose its omnipotence. But a necessarily omnipotent being can't lose its omnipotence on pain of contradiction. And therefore it would be a logical impossibility for a necessarily omnipotent being to create such a stone. And since it doesn't matter if an omnipotent being can do the logically impossible, it follows that the paradox isn't really a problem for the concept of omnipotence.
An omnipotent, omniscient God is logically incoherent. In the same way that you can dismiss a married bachelor in any possible universes, I can also dismiss the God that you're presenting.
But as we've seen, there are many potential solutions to the paradox of the stone. And so I don't think we can, Patchy Alex, simply dismiss the possibility of an all-powerful being.
We might subjectively agree that existence is better than non-existence, but we can't prove that existence adds intrinsic objective value to a concept. This is what Immanuel Kant said in his Critique of Pure Reason, that existence is not a predicate.
Now, Kant's objection is a particular pet peeve of mine, but I don't blame Alex for raising it at all, because wherever you read about the ontological argument, you'll almost always encounter this objection. So let's give it some thought. What does Kant mean by existence is not a predicate? A predicate is the part of the sentence that adds conceptual content to the subject. So think about this proposition, the dog is barking. In this proposition, the dog is the subject and is barking is the predicate. Is barking is the predicate because it's adding content to your concept of the dog. In this case, it happens to be telling you what the dog is doing. But now think about the proposition, the dog exists. What is that telling you about the dog? It might help to think about it like this. Picture a dog in your head. Okay, got it? Now picture it barking. What you're picturing should be slightly different. Okay, picture the dog again, but now picture it as existing. Nothing changes. Why not? Because to even conceive of the dog in the first place is to conceive of it as existing. You can't conceive of something without conceiving of that thing as existing, even if only as a concept in your mind. And so existence doesn't add any conceptual content to a thing, and therefore is not a real predicate. But if existence is not a real predicate, then you can't add it on to your concept of God as the most perfect being. Which I guess is what some people think the modal ontological argument is trying to do. But it really isn't. Firstly, it's controversial whether or not existence is a predicate. If I say to you, Winnie the Pooh exists, how does that not add content to your concept of Winnie the Pooh? At first you thought of Winnie the Pooh as, a mere fictional character, as a concept in your mind, but now you're thinking of him as existing in reality. Ah, comes the reply. But Ryan, you're equivocating on the word existence. Yeah, sure, existence in the mind might be a predicate, and existence in reality might be a predicate, but existence simpliciter is not. Okay, fine. But isn't that all Anselm needs for his argument to run? Anselm never argues that it's greater for God to exist than not exist. What he argues is that it's greater for God to exist in both the mind and reality than just the mind alone. So it's not at all clear that Anselm needs existence simpliciter to be a predicate for his argument to work. Secondly, all Malcolm and Hartshorne need for their modal argument to work is that necessary existence be a predicate. And surely necessary existence is a predicate. If you knew that Winnie the Pooh was a necessarily existent being, how would that not blow your mind? That there's no possible set of circumstances such that Winnie the Pooh could not exist. Of course it would. And so necessary existence is adding conceptual content and therefore must be a predicate. But perhaps you think, no. Qualified or not, existence is never a predicate. Not existence in the mind, not existence in reality, not necessary existence. No, it's never a predicate. Well, that's fine because Plantinga's argument, which is the one presented in the video, doesn't even need that much. All Plantinga needs is for one of God's properties to be necessary. Because if one of God's properties is necessary, then God must have that property in all possible worlds. But if God has that property in all possible worlds, then he must exist in all possible worlds. Because a being can't have a property in a world where it does not exist. Otherwise you get all kinds of ridiculous absurdities like non-existent horses that nevertheless have 4 legs and red hair. If you want more on that argument, I'd highly recommend reading chapter 8 of Plantinga's book, The Nature of Necessity. So Kant's objection utterly fails. But how did this happen? Isn't Kant supposed to be a genius? How did he end up raising such a bad objection to these arguments? Well, the fact is he didn't. He only raised it against Descartes' version of the argument, which is very different from Anselm's version or Plantinga's version. So much so that Graham Oppy puts it in a completely different category, which he calls definitional ontological arguments. And yeah, Kant's argument holds much more water against Descartes' argument than the others. All this is to say is that Kant's objection fails to refute Anselm's argument, it fails to refute Malcolm and Hartshorne's argument, and it fails to refute Plantinga's argument. So, so much for that objection.
Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial.
Which is exactly why I'm going to try to rebut them.
Look, I'm as contrarian as the next guy, and coming from Northern Ireland, that's saying quite a lot.
Never! Never! Never!
But premises 2 to 6 are largely uncontroversial for a reason. And that reason is that they're just logical deductions from the first premise. And these deductions are valid on a system of modal logic called S5. So the only real way to reject one of these premises is to reject the whole system of S5 itself.
Look at premises 2. A maximally great being exists in some possible world. But by the logic that you've just presented, this simply can't be the case. You just said so yourself that for a maximally great being to be truly maximally great, it must exist in all possible worlds. So if it only exists in some possible worlds, then it's not maximally great. This is, once again, say it with me kids, logically incoherent.
Except it isn't, because premise 2 isn't saying that a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds but not others. What it's saying is it exists in at least one possible world and then suspends judgment on whether it exists in the other ones or not. Think about it like this. Imagine you're looking at a house, but you're looking at it through bushes and trees and other buildings, so all you can see is the kitchen window. The curtains are open and you can see that the lights are on. Now, that information on its own doesn't tell you very much about whether the lights are on or off in the rest of the house. But then suppose that you also knew that this particular house had only one light switch. And when the switch was on, all the lights in all the rooms were on. And when the switch was off, all the lights in all the rooms were off. Well, now that does tell you quite a bit about whether the lights are on or off in the rest of the house. You can deduce that because you can see the lights are on in the kitchen, that therefore, assuming everything's working properly, that the lights must be on in the rest of the house too. In the same way, because maximal greatness is a universal property, that is, exemplified in all possible worlds, or no possible worlds, we can deduce that if it's exemplified in one possible world, then it's not the case that it's exemplified in no possible worlds, and so must be exemplified in all possible worlds. And if it's exemplified in all possible worlds, then it must be exemplified in the actual world, because the actual world is a possible world. And therefore, a maximally great being must exist.
So let's lay out this argument in some no-nonsense premises. Premise 1. God has all perfections. Premise 2. Necessary existence, that is, existing, is a perfection. Premise 3. If God has necessary existence, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. The problem lies in the very first word of the very first premise. God. God has all perfections. We're assuming that God exists because for God to have something, this God must exist. So we need to make a very subtle change to the first premise. And that is this. We need to say, instead of saying God has all perfections, we should be saying, if God exists, then God has all perfections. And it seems like a subtle change, but it's really not. So now we're saying, if God exists, then he has all perfections. And necessary existence is one of those perfections. So we're saying, if God exists, God has necessary existence. If God exists, then he exists.
Alex concludes his video by explaining why his formulation of the argument is circular. But I think it's important to note that Alex's formulation is not Anselm's version, which looks like this, and it's not Plantinga's version, which looks like this. It's really closest to Descartes' version. Moreover, his argument as to why it's circular is really just a spelling out of why Descartes' argument fails if existence is not a predicate. Because if existence is not a predicate, then, as Alex rightly says, when we say God in the first premise, we would already assume that he exists. And so to deduce his existence from this premise would be to argue in a circle. But as I've already argued, even if Kant's objection does refute Descartes' argument, it has no bearing on Anselm's argument or Plantinga's argument. And since the Reasonable Faith video is presenting Plantinga's argument, this objection, I think, ends up being a bit of a red herring. That's it for this video. I'd just like to end by thanking Alex for encouraging me to make this video, and also for the use of his old camera. That's right, this whole thing was shot on what could very well have been the same camera that Alex used to shoot his original video. So I think that's irony. So Alex, thanks again, and I hope there was something in this video that we hadn't talked about already. And to everyone else, I hope you really enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know. Maybe I'll invest in some of my own equipment and start making a few more of these. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.